This video is going to focus on skin color and skin markings. The most significant factor in skin color that we see is melanin, which is a protein, but it's not the only factor. We'll get to the other ones after this. Melanin is produced by melanocytes. It is a brownish color, but then there's some variables right there. So there's other forms that are brownish black or reddish yellow. And this protein accumulates in the keratinocytes of the basal and spinosum layers. And the amount of melanin does vary with a few different factors, one of them, of course, being the exposure to UV rays of sunlight. More exposure is a higher amount of melanin, which makes sense as to why we get tan when we are out in the sun. But when we see people with different skin colors, they do have the exact same number of melanocytes. So the number of the cells is the same, but then here's lists why we see a variation of color. So with dark skinned people, their cells are producing more melanin. So greater quantities of the protein itself. Also the melanin granules in the keratinocytes are more spread out. So that means the whole cell looks brown. And that melanin breaks down more slowly, so it lasts a longer time. And then those cells are seen throughout the epidermis. So all of those factors working together is why darker skinned people look darker. Whereas lighter skinned people, the melanin is clumped near the nucleus of the keratinocyte. So when it's all kind of clumped together, less color is what we see. And that melanin breaks down quicker. And then there's very little melanin seen beyond the basal layer of the epidermis. So when you look at them under the microscope, they're very similar. You see the stratum basal layer, that up and down kind of curvy layer, and then the cells with the melanin or the melanocytes within that layer. The basal and the spinosum is where you'll find those. So some other factors of skin color, hemoglobin, which is a protein in our blood, is also found in these cells and is responsible for the red tint of skin that we have sometimes. Carotene is another pigment, and this pigment is yellow. We see it in egg yolks and some vegetables that are yellow or orange. That protein concentrates in the stratum corneum or the subcutaneous fat layer. When we see blueness of the skin, that is called cyanosis, and it is from a deficiency of oxygen in the circulating blood. This can come from an airway obstruction or lung disease or other possibilities. An erythema is an abnormal redness of the skin when the cutaneous vessels are dilated. So this might happen when you're exercising or if it's super hot outside, sunburn, if you're angry or embarrassed. I have a friend that's just when she gets nervous, she's got a big red spot on her neck. So other options other than melanin. So sometimes we see a pale or ashen color, that's called pallor, and that's when there's little blood flow through the skin, and so that dermal collagen, which is white, kind of shows through the epidermal layer. This might come from emotional stress, a low blood pressure, or shock. Maybe if we're cold, our blood is not flowing as well as it should. Another way to be pale is albinism, and that's when there's a lack of melanin. We can see this in skin or white hair or even pink eyes. This is an inherited gene. It is a recessive, and that just means that the melanin is not produced. And then the last skin color example is jaundice, and that's a yellowing of the skin and the sclera. That's the white of our eyes. And that's if we have extra bilirubin in our blood. This could happen from cancer, hepatitis, cirrhosis, basically when our liver is not functioning properly. Skin color is one of the biggest variations in our species, and there's kind of a long background of the evolution of our skin color. It's a combination of selection. So if you go back to your lesson on evolution, the evolution lesson would tell you that when there's a favorable variation, that variation is going to survive and reproduce. And so that plays a role in the skin colors that we see today, because we are able to have a difference in our exposure to those UV rays, depending on the skin color. So we know that UV radiation has some adverse effects, can cause skin cancer. It also breaks down the folic acid that we need for our cells to divide, for our fertility and for our fetal development. But also those ultraviolet rays have a desirable effect. They do stimulate the synthesis of vitamin D. That means making the vitamin D, and that helps our calcium absorption. So looking back over generations, populations that were native to the tropics and their descendants, they have a darker skin to screen out excessive UV rays. So that just means over time that the darker skinned individuals had kind of an advantage, and so they were able to survive and reproduce. And this is a little biology lesson tucked in here. But because they were able to, that darker skin screened out the extra UV rays, whereas populations native to far northern or southern latitudes where there's less sunlight, they have lighter skin. And that allows the UV rays to penetrate their skin so they can start making that vitamin D. So just depending on, the location of what kind of skin color we see, but there is a huge variety. On average, women would have a 4% lighter skin than men. We need more vitamin D and folic acid to produce or to support pregnancy and lactation. There are some exceptions. High altitude and dry air are going to increase that darker color, but that UV rays does account for up to 77% of the variation in our human skin color. So that's a big, so it's saying only 23% of the variation that we see is from genetics. Onto markings. Some markings that we see specifically that jump out first would be friction ridges. Those are the markings on the fingertips that we call our fingerprint. So they increase our ability to hold on to things, and we know that everyone has a unique pattern. Even twins do not have identical fingerprints. We also have those deeper lines called flexion lines. We see them on our palms and our wrists, our elbows. They are found where the skin folds during the flexion of the joints, and you'll get into flexion of the joints later. But the skin right there is more tightly bound to the connective tissue, and that's what makes that little fold. We know we see freckles and moles, and this can be tan to black, and it's just kind of a clump of cells with increased melanin. Freckles are flat, whereas moles are elevated, and they might even have hair. And of course, moles need to be watched for any changes, which we'll talk about when we get to cancer. We'll talk about kind of the warning signs there. And then birthmarks can also be patches of discolored skin, but they are originally caused by benign tumors of the capillaries. Some disappeared in childhood, but then others last for life.